So, okay, so we're
I have
very
to, I have to
honored
prove, I
to,
have to prove that I'm being recorded. Okay.
okay, so very honored to have Kent Keith be our presenter today. And you saw his bio. He's been all over the place doing all kinds of things, but just so impressive to be the head of DBED, where you're working with the government people, and then working at Chaminade as a school that has professors who are smart, and then with the Greenleaf Group, working with taking all of those leadership skills and putting them into books and leadership training is so impressive. And so, thank you so much for being here, Kent. But the floor is all yours. I'm going to do a spotlight on you.
Great. Thanks very much. Good evening, and appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction, Naomi, and thanks for the opportunity to share a few ideas with you this evening. I hope you're safe and healthy. This is a really challenging time. So I've been asked to say a few words about leading at work. I'm certainly happy to do that. My experience is that the dominant model or idea about leadership is what I call the power model. According to the power model, leadership's about acquiring and wielding power. It's about taking charge and making people do things. It's about how to attack and win. It's about manipulation and coercion. Most of all, it's about grabbing power for oneself. So I do not recommend being a power-oriented leader. If power is what you seek, you'll never get enough and you'll never be happy. In the meantime, the power model easily becomes unethical because it's about using people for one's own ends. Finally, it just doesn't work very well. It's not good for colleagues. It's not good for serving customers and the larger community. There is another model or idea about leadership, and it's not the dominant model. I call it the service model of leadership. The service model is not about acquiring and wielding power. It's about making a difference in the lives of others. It is ethical, practical, and meaningful. We have plenty of evidence that it's highly effective. This is the model of leadership that I strongly recommend to you. It's the perfect model for implementing the Rotary motto, service above self. People who ascribe to the service model are often called servant leaders. If the word servant is not comfortable for you, you can call it service leadership or serving leadership or just good leadership. Actually, you can call it whatever you want. What you do matters more than what you call it. I've been part of the international servant leadership movement for 30 years, and I'm comfortable with the words servant and servant leadership, so those are the words that I will be using. The mission of the servant leader is to identify and meet the needs of others. Servant leaders identify and meet the needs of their colleagues so they can perform at their highest levels. They identify and meet the needs of their customers so they will be happy and will come back and will tell their friends. At its most fundamental level, it's very simple. The idea that leaders should serve others is an idea that goes back thousands of years and can be found in a number of traditions, including the Rotary tradition. However, there is a modern servant leadership movement. It was launched in the United States in 1970 by Robert K. Greenleaf, who coined the words servant leader and servant leadership in his classic essay, The Servant as Leader. Greenleaf was born and raised in Indiana and worked for AT&T for 38 years, from 1926 to 1964. During those years, AT&T had 1 million employees and was the largest or one of the largest corporations in the world. Greenleaf did personnel and training work, and he gradually rose through the ranks to become the Director of Management Research. So it was his job to educate and train the leaders and managers of AT&T, one of the biggest corporations in the world, to be as effective as possible. Greenleaf noticed that there were leaders who were focused on acquiring power and wealth for themselves, and there were leaders who were focused on serving others, their colleagues and their customers. After 38 years of experience, he concluded that the most effective leaders were those who focused on serving others. Greenleaf said that servant leadership starts with the desire to serve, not the desire to lead. Of course, there are many ways to serve. When a person with a desire to serve sees the opportunity to serve by leading, then that person accepts leadership responsibility and becomes a servant leader. Greenleaf focused on growing people because it's a triple win. When people grow, they benefit personally and professionally. They're growing. Their capacity grows, so the capacity of the organization grows. When the capacity of their organization grows, it can do things better or do things it was never able to do before. So individuals benefit, the organization benefits, and those served by the organization benefit. That's why Greenleaf said that the best test of servant leadership was this: do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? Greenleaf also thought that servant leaders should be aware of the impact their decisions have on those who are disadvantaged. He asked, what is the effect on the least privileged in society? Will they benefit or at least not be further deprived? Finally, he thought that servant leaders should care about everyone their organizations touch, all stakeholders, not just one group, such as shareholders. Before we go further, let me comment on two common misconceptions about servant leadership. First, servant leadership is not soft. Servant leaders can and do make hard decisions whenever necessary in order to serve others. Second, servant leaders can exercise power. However, when they exercise power, they exercise it with others, not over others, and they exercise it on behalf of others, not for their own personal benefit. To a servant leader, power is only a tool, and usually not the most important tool. It's only a means and not an end. I love the fact that the modern servant leadership movement grew out of Robert Greenleaf's experience in a large competitive for-profit business. He was making a practical observation about what worked best for the business. He knew that what worked best was servant leadership. For centuries, servant leaders have provided anecdotal evidence of the effectiveness of servant leadership. We know that servant leadership principles are being implemented in the public, private, academic, military, and nonprofit sectors. Of course, every organization has its own culture and applies servant leadership principles in its own way. We know that for-profit companies that have implemented servant leadership principles have been financially successful. Many have been on the Fortune magazine list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. These companies include Starbucks, The Container Store, Aflac, Synovus Financial, Southwest Airlines, and TD Industries. While surprising to some people, there are military leaders who promote servant leadership. They focus on taking care of the troops. About 15 years ago, leadership scholars began to conduct empirically rigorous studies of servant leadership in the workplace. The results have been very positive. For example, research has shown that servant leaders facilitate effective teamwork. And teamwork is really important nowadays. Servant leadership may enhance both job performance and commitment to the organization. Servant leaders may inspire followers to serve the community in which the organization is embedded. Research has revealed that employees of servant leaders are more helping and creative than those working with leaders who scored lower on servant leadership. More helping and creative is a competitive advantage. And servant leadership has been shown to be positively related to employee job satisfaction. When you get good employees, you want them to stay. You want them to be satisfied with their work. Back in 2012, Dr. Suzanne Peterson and her colleagues studied 126 chief executive officers in technology organizations in Silicon Valley. They interviewed these CEOs at length, hour after hour, and then classified them as founders, narcissists, or servant leaders. They found a positive relationship between servant leadership and firm performance. Companies led by servant leaders generated better financial results than companies led by founders or narcissists. The researchers said that CEOs could improve their firm's performance if they adopted more inclusive forms of leadership, such as servant leadership, that take into account a broader number of stakeholders and that are more other-focused. There are studies now being prepared for publication in academic journals that conclude that servant leadership is good for all stakeholders, including shareholders, because servant leadership increases the profitability of for-profit organizations. For example, Dr. Bob Lydon, a professor of management at the University of Illinois at Chicago, will be publishing research that he and his team conducted in South Korea. The study showed that as servant leadership goes up, profits go up. Other scholars have seen similar results in their research on businesses here in the United States. Today, there are so many studies of servant leadership in the workplace that we are now seeing meta-studies, or studies of the studies, and these too are very positive. Dr. Leiden reports, for example, that these meta-studies have concluded servant leadership is significantly related to outcomes in all cultures. Servant leadership is a win-win approach in which employees flourish while at the same time revenue and profits grow. Servant leadership is effective in motivating even employees who are high in self-interest to also engage in serving or helping behaviors. Finally, very recent studies show that servant leadership works in times of crisis, as evidenced by the ability of servant leaders to help employees deal with the anxiety produced by COVID-19 and motivate them to stay engaged in their jobs and help members of their communities. So, anecdotal evidence and empirical research make it clear that servant leadership is very effective. It works, and it works very well indeed. But why does it work? Well, why wouldn't it work? Think about it. Servant leaders identify and meet the needs of others. They identify and meet the needs of their colleagues so they can perform at their highest levels. They identify and meet the needs of their customers so they will be truly served. Colleagues perform well and customers get what they need. Why wouldn't that work? When you think about it, it's pretty simple. Of course, there are specific leadership practices that help servant leaders to be effective. For example, in my own writing and speaking, I talk about self-awareness, listening, changing the pyramid, developing your colleagues, coaching, not controlling, unleashing the energy and intelligence of others, and foresight. These are 7 practices that I consider to be key practices. Right now, a number of us are working on a 5-module Rotary leadership program that includes the 7 key practices I have mentioned, plus persuasion instead of coercion, conceptualization, and stewardship. These are all practical things that servant leaders do that help them to be successful. Beyond the key practices, there are underlying attitudes and principles that help servant leaders to be effective. I'd like to talk about 2 of them. First, servant leaders go beyond extrinsic motivation to emphasize intrinsic motivation, which supports higher levels of performance. Second, servant leaders promote meaning at work, a very important intrinsic motivator. These ideas are important foundations for the success of servant leaders, so let's look at each of them. First, let's talk about motivation. When we talk about motivation, we usually compare extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. We all know the difference. Extrinsic motivation is about what you have to do, not what you want to do. The task needs to be done, but it's usually not fun or interesting or fulfilling or meaningful. Managers therefore offer incentives or even threats of punishment to get the work done. They tell people, if you do this, you will get that. And that is a reward not related to the work itself. Intrinsic motivation is basically the opposite. It's about what you want to do, not what you have to do. People are intrinsically motivated when they do something because it is fun or interesting or fulfilling or meaningful. When you're intrinsically motivated, the work itself is your reward. We don't say if you get this, if you do this, you'll get that. We say if you do this, you're going to like it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. One of the most read articles in the history of the Harvard Business Review was an article by Frederick Hertzberg published back in 1968 titled, "One More Time, How Do You Motivate Employees?" Hertzberg argued that some factors are hygiene factors, basically extrinsic, and others are intrinsic motivators. He said hygiene factors are company policy and administration, supervision, relationship with a supervisor, work conditions, salary, relationship with peers, personal life, relationships with subordinates, status, and security. These factors are the primary cause of extreme dissatisfaction on the job. Employers need to get these factors right so that employees will not be dissatisfied. However, more and better hygiene factors will not produce extreme satisfaction. Only intrinsic motivators will do that. Those intrinsic motivators include achievement, recognition, the work itself, responsibility, advancement, and growth. The hygiene factors and intrinsic motivators are not the opposite of each other. They represent different needs. They are both important. However, if you want high levels of performance, your colleagues need to be intrinsically motivated. That's why servant leaders focus on intrinsic motivation instead of extrinsic motivation. Now, this is where meaning becomes important. Dr. Kenneth W. Thomas and his colleagues spent 16 years studying intrinsic motivation at work, and they identified a sense of meaning as an important intrinsic reward. So people who find meaning in their work are intrinsically motivated and perform at higher levels. Meaningful work was central to Greenleaf's business ethic. He said, "The work exists for the person as much as the person exists for the work." Put another way, the business exists as much to provide meaningful work to the person as it exists to provide a product or service to the customer. That focus on meaning turns out to be very practical in terms of employee performance, commitment, and satisfaction. Common sense tells us that if you find meaning in your work and you're intrinsically motivated, you'll be able to do more and do it better for longer. Dr. Adam Grant, a professor at the Wharton School, explored this issue in his research. He separated what he called prosocial motivation and intrinsic motivation to study their effects, if any, on each other. He defined prosocial motivation as the desire to benefit or help others, to serve a greater purpose. He said that intrinsic motivation comes from interest in the work or the enjoyment of doing the work. So Dr. Grant studied 140 workers at a telephone call center and 58 employees at a fire department. He focused on the issues of persistence, performance, and productivity. Grant concluded that employees display higher levels of persistence, performance, and productivity when they experience prosocial motivation and intrinsic motivation together. Well, that matches what Greenleaf said about servant leadership. Greenleaf said that servant leadership starts with a desire to serve, to benefit others. That's the prosocial motivation. Greenleaf also emphasized growth and meaning. That's the intrinsic motivation. So when you put the two together, you get the result that Grant had in his research: higher levels of persistence, performance, and productivity. How important is meaning at work? Well, Catherine Bailey and Adrian Madden interviewed 135 people in the United Kingdom who work in a variety of occupations. They published their results in an article in the MIT Sloan Management Review titled, "What Makes Work Meaningful or Meaningless?" They said that the research shows that meaningfulness is more important to employees than any other aspect of work. I repeat, meaningfulness is more important to employees than any other aspect of work. It's more important to employees than pay and rewards, opportunities for promotion, or working conditions. So how do you promote meaning at work? Dr. Thomas recommended 5 building blocks of meaningfulness. 1, building a non-cynical climate. 2, clearly identifying passions. 3, providing an exciting vision. 4, ensuring relevant task purposes. And 5, providing whole tasks. Because meaning is so important, servant leaders do their best to become meaning makers. They do whatever they can to create an environment in which meaning is enhanced for their colleagues. They find meaning in the work of others and share that meaning with them. They may even redesign work to make it more meaningful. One leader who focused on purpose and meaning as a way of lifting her colleagues in her company was Cheryl Batchelder. Batchelder was the CEO of Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen from 2007 to 2017. The restaurant chain had $2.4 billion in sales and 2,187 restaurants in 27 countries. Sales and profits had been declining for years. But 6 years after Batchelder assumed leadership, sales had climbed 25%, market share had grown from 14 to 21%, profitability was up by 40%, and the stock price was up 450%. The improvement was dramatic. In her book, Dare to Serve, Batchelder said that one important step she took was to invite the company's leaders to develop a personal purpose that gave meaning to their work. She said it was the leader's responsibility to bring purpose and meaning to the work of the organization. Popeyes conducted workshops that took team members through several exercises regarding their life experiences, values, strengths, and action plans. Batchelder said that the leaders at Popeyes who had an action plan for their personal purpose were having more impact on the business. She concluded that personal purpose leads to sustained superior performance. So the modern servant leadership movement was launched by a businessman who concluded that servant leaders were more effective and got better business results than power-oriented leaders. We have anecdotal evidence and strong empirical research that demonstrate that servant leadership works well for all stakeholders. There are key practices that help servant leaders to be effective. Servant leaders also promote intrinsic motivation and enhance the meaning and purpose that help people to perform at their highest levels. I'd like to close by saying that if you wish to succeed during your career, I highly recommend that you lead the way servant leaders do. Identify and meet the needs of others. Implement key practices like listening to people and growing people. Lay a strong foundation by promoting intrinsic motivation and meaning at work. If you do, you will make a positive difference in the lives of your colleagues and customers, and you and your organization will be successful indeed. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hey, Ken, thank you for that. Very much enjoyed it. Lots came out of it. I guess one of, and probably an obvious question is, I guess I have two questions. Is why do you think, more leaders have not taken on servant leadership if, there's all of this
Yeah,
evidence to back it up?
it's so good. Why aren't more people doing it? Yep.
Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah. And I'm not sure that there is a definitive answer, but let's start with culture. So most of us are raised in a culture that defines or depicts or portrays leadership in power terms. And that's all aspects of the culture, things that people say, movies, newspaper articles, whatever it is. The decisive, power-oriented leader, pacing the floor, issuing orders, whatever. So I think there's a huge cultural issue here. Secondly, those sorts of leaders get attention, get press, and it kind of feeds on itself. There are, I believe, millions of servant leaders that aren't being reported. They're not on the front page. They're quietly doing what servant leaders do. And a lot of it's in their family, their community, their organization. They're not looking for credit. They're not trying to be famous. They're just holding their families and organizations and communities together. I'm afraid that the power model grows out of fear and a sense of inadequacy and the desire to sort of, protect oneself by grabbing what you think you need and fighting off other people. I think there's some, it's from the amygdala rather than the neocortex. It's sort of the reptilian brain. And that's too bad, because I think that there's so much meaning and satisfaction and joy and excitement to be had through the servant leadership route, whatever you call it, that if people really tasted it, if they saw people, if they saw examples of it and got used to it, they go, wow, I'm not going back to the power model. This is really good. But, if you're not aware and it's not being promoted by the culture, and it's really hard to explain. The research that has blossomed in the last 15 years, I'm really excited about, because we had anecdotal information before, testimonials. I did it and it worked. Look how well it worked. Now we've got these really reputable studies by recognized leadership scholars who finally got tired of doing transformational leadership or leader-member exchange and have been shifting into servant leadership. And so now, if anybody is sort of, in doubt, maybe I'll try it, maybe I won't try it. There's really, really wonderful practical evidence available to help somebody get off the fence and say, give it a try. But, I think it's always been there, but it's never been dominant. And I think we have a chance now to really achieve more of a breakthrough. Sorry, that was a long answer, but it's a really good question.
Hey, Ken, and I apologize if you mentioned this earlier. As we go through the generations, we can see a definite shift in leadership styles. So, for example, it was more authoritative, more directive. Now it's more collaboration. Where do you see servant leadership in, say, for example, Gen Z or even Gen Alpha?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I'm very hopeful about the future of servant leadership because I think it matches newer generations quite well, at least surveys and interactions and so forth. It's not authoritarian. When Robert Greenleaf drew his organizational chart, everybody was on the same level. The idea was it's a team. He really worked hard to promote teams at every level, including the top level. And these were teams of equals, not because everybody has the same background or ability, but because they have different backgrounds and abilities, and they're equally important to the success of the team. So he drew a flat hierarchy. He emphasized teams. Obviously, coordination, collaboration, cooperation. I mean, those are big things in servant leadership. So I'm hopeful that will resonate, with the newer generations, because number one, I think it works best, and number two, it seems to match what people are interested in having. By the way, I'm certainly not presenting myself as an expert on any younger generation. Um, just watching and listening and being hopeful, because I think it really, I hope it's the wave of the future. I hope you guys will make it the wave of the future.
Thanks, Ken. And I do want to make a comment that I believe you wrote the book anyway.
I did.
I did read it while younger, and what stuck with me is the phrase "do good anyway." I believe it's one of the commandments.
Yes, it is. Good. I'm glad you are doing good anyway, aren't you? You are, yes, of course.
Trying.
We're all trying.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Carol?
Hello. Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for speaking. Gosh, I trying to think of a question, but what really resonated with me here in your talk was just doing meaningful work, and that's how you motivate people, and that's something that really stuck with me. I know in these Rotary meetings, sometimes it's hard to motivate people, and how do you do that? But this resonated with me in the sense that maybe we need to do things, we need to take a step back and look at what's meaningful to the members, what's meaningful for others. So thank you for that.
You're welcome, and I like the way you just described that. I'm not comfortable talking about motivating people. I'm very comfortable talking about how do you discover what they're already motivated about, what already motivates them. It's there. I mean, people are already motivated in regard to something, and drawing that out and connecting with that and helping them to, do they have certain hopes or dreams or ideas of things that they want to do, and tapping into that. You don't have to motivate anybody; they're already motivated. So I like the way you express that. I think that's practical, and I think that's what servant leaders try to do, is help people find the meaning that's already there. We tend to get down in the trenches in our jobs every day, and we can become disconnected from the meaning that really is there when we stop to think about it. I mean, think about the difference we're making in the lives of individuals and families and organizations and communities. When you stop to think about it, I mean, every organization is making a difference. And people need things, and we go to work to provide them with the things they need. And that should give us meaning, that we're making that difference in their lives. But you have to take the time to sit down and think about it and say, oh yeah, that's how those dots connect. That's how I'm having an impact. That's how I'm helping people to live better, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, thank you.
Kent, in Rotary clubs, and many of the clubs have seasoned older members have strong opinions, and your wife does a lot of conflict resolution, right? So when you have a disagreement, for instance, there was a district governor that was talking about how some members felt that our DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion statement was not appropriate for Rotary, that it was political, that nobody should be telling the Rotary clubs how to organize, and so it split the club up. That you had people who felt one way, and then people who felt we need to be more inclusive, more accepting. So how would you, as a leader, bring the group together so we can find common ground?
I think that would be difficult. I'm yeah, well, let me just put it this way. I've spent my whole life developing my own biases, and I've become quite fond of them. I mean, this just happens, right? I mean, we have the experiences that we have, we form opinions, and it's hard to let go of them. Um, Most of the time, I found that if you can spend some time sharing politely but honestly about what you feel and why you feel that way, you can engage and you can learn from each other. You can actually have a dialogue in which something comes out of the conversation that none of the parties imagined or thought about before the conversation began. So it's even more than I think this and you think that, and then we go home. Something new emerges. So I'm really hopeful, but people have to be willing to really listen and have to actually respect each other, or it's hard to accomplish anything. I mean, there are some facts that really impress me. I mean, I'm really glad that we raised our children here in Hawaii. My wife is Japanese and Swedish. My oldest daughter is Japanese. My youngest daughter is Romanian Gypsy. My son is Romanian Caucasian. There aren't a lot of places in America where we could grow up and nobody would notice or nobody would care. I mean, we're not perfect, by the way, but we're really good. And, and that's made it, we travel as a family on the mainland and it's a different feeling. Not because they're bad people, but they have a different experience. I'm really impressed that demographers now estimate that by 2042, and we're talking only 21 years from now, Caucasians will be a minority in America. And I'm quite happy with that. You look at who was living here before Caucasians expanded across the continent into Hawaii. You're talking about indigenous and other people. They were not Caucasian. I think that bodes well for our future, but it's really hard for some people to adjust. And attacking them will probably just get resistance, and they'll just close off. And so I'm hopeful that excuse me. I'm hopeful that if people can be engaged in a respectful way, listen, draw them out. Why do you think that way? And see whether some kind of new vision can be formed. Doesn't always work. It's certainly worth the effort. Certainly worth the effort, because things are changing whether we like it or not. And I may not be around to see it, but I think it'll be good for our country when it happens. Sorry, I think maybe that was a political comment. I'm sorry. I was trying not to be. I wasn't naming any party, but everything is political, isn't it? I mean, with a small p, right? Everything's political. Most political organization in most states is a university, not a political party. Lots of things are political.
Thank you. Sandy, you have a question for Kent?
I just want to thank you, Kent. I've been with UH for a few decades now, and I've been a super follower of servant leadership since the beginning, and a fan of yours for many years. I just want to thank you for being able to articulate the essence of servant leadership in the way that you speak and the way that you present it. And it's a real gift. I'm trying to learn how to do that, but it's really tough. But I just want to say mahalo, because there's so much aloha in there too.
Thank you, Sandy. You're very welcome. And one of the great pleasures for me is being with Rotarians. I mean, Rotarians understand this. I mean, how can you do what Rotarians do? And service above self is the motto. And I mean, Rotarians are in this zone already. So we're really talking about, affirming that with some ideas about, specific ideas about leadership. And it's meant to be encouraging. No, I am encouraged by Rotarians. I mean, I get a lot out of being part of the Rotary movement. So people like you guys, really, really inspire me. So thank you. Thank you for that.
You.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, we're good. Thank you, Ken. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
you're very welcome. God bless you. Take care.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.